Good morning. It's time to start. I'd like to welcome everybody here on this rainy day. We're going to be continuing our study this morning with the influence of a woman. As the screen behind me indicates, today the topic will be Abigail. If you don't have a lesson sheet, there might still be some in the back. In fact, I think Mark made some additional copies that have both today's lesson, Abigail, and then next week's lesson on the back, Bathsheba. So if you get one of those, you're set for next week as well. Otherwise, there are separate sheets back there on the table. So if you'll recall, last week we talked about David's first wife, Michal, and the topic stretched several years because we're introduced to Michal when she and David are young newlyweds. And then he has to run for his life and leave her behind. Her father Saul gave her to another man as wife. And David doesn't get her back years later when he is finally the king of the combined Israel and Judah. And if you'll recall, in a moment when he is very happy and excited, she confronts him with some sarcasm and some criticism. He doesn't take it well. She's not very effective in her influence in this instant, and it doesn't end well for either one. So today we're going to backtrack a little bit and talk about another wife of David. At the time he meets her, though, she is married to somebody else. This is going to be Abigail. He is now, in the history of his life, has left Michal behind, and he's on the run from King Saul. He's being pursued in the wilderness. He has collected at least 600 men. So he's got kind of a small army as he lives in the wilderness at this time. This army is not looking for a fight. They're just trying to elude the forces of King Saul. So on this, at this instant, he is in an area of Israel where a rich man, Nabal, has his flocks. And we're in 1 Samuel chapter 25 when the context of this occurs. So Nabal, a rich man, described in the text as an evil and harsh man. That's in verse 3, talking about him. His own servants will describe him as a worthless man, and no one can speak to him. So it doesn't come across as a good character so far. When you've got a traveling army back at this time or throughout history, and they come across food sources in the wild, what do the armies normally do? You loot. That's right. Yeah, it's not unusual for the army to just take whatever they find for their own sustenance. That's not good behavior. That's just what is done. Sometimes they pay the locals for their crops, for their animals. Oftentimes they don't. So what's unique here is David, having been a shepherd himself, I suppose influenced him, because they don't take all these sheep that they're surrounded with. They just seemingly protect the shepherds and the sheep that belong to Nabal. So that's of note, his behavior there. Now in the story, it's time to shear the sheep. And David, having been a shepherd, knows the process. Apparently, it's kind of like a harvest festival. If you have sheep, you celebrate this time because you're going to be finally profiting from all this year's worth of keeping these sheep. And there is a feast associated with the shearing of the sheep. So David hears that that's this time for Nabal. And so he sends some of his young men to Nabal to greet him and to explain the service that David's men had provided to Nabal and request something of this feast. And David phrases this as, whatever you have laying about, we'll take, and please and thank you. So Nabal receives these men from David and not only refuses to provide any food for David's men, but he also insults David. Now, was David's request, in your opinion, was David's request for a portion of the feast, is that inappropriate to ask? Some say no. Anyone? Eric? Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. So Eric says it's maybe like a mafia shakedown, and you can make that parallel. Glenn?
The other side of it is, it's not like David can make up things like, oh, well, I'm protecting your sheep.
Right.
And he had to do it. So
right.
He must have pushed away some bad folks that were trying to steal or David.
So Glenn says it wasn't like David to lie about providing a service, and that's true as well. In fact, David tells Nabal to ask your shepherds and confirm what we've been doing among them. So, it's probably not an inappropriate request to make that David makes here from Nabal. Could Nabal have respectfully declined to provide? And would David's reaction maybe have been different? Because David reacts very strongly to Nabal's reaction to the request. And what is David's reaction? What's that? He puts on his sword. And what is his vow to do as a result of Nabal's reaction? What's that? Kill all the males. Okay. So I put this down as bloodthirsty reaction because he is after blood. Now, is he right to respond this way? Is he justified? Okay, Julie says it. Okay, so is that what caused? Is it the lack of resources being provided, or is it the insult that he's reacting? Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's the insult, and that kind of reaction is never justified. But that's what David has vowed to do. So he gets 400 of his 600 men armed, and they're off in a hurry to go and kill Nabal and all the males in his family. Now, the servants who listened to this interaction between David's men and Nabal, they go to Abigail, who is Nabal's wife, and she's described how in the text? What do we know about Abigail so far? Beautiful and intelligent. Okay, so she's going to prove her intelligence through this discourse that's coming up with David. And it's interesting that the servants go to her. She hears about the exchange. She knows what's been said through the servant. Does she know what David is going to do? She definitely anticipates what David is going to do. Okay, and the servants also must have had some indication of what was about to happen, because they warn her that evil is plotted against us, and so they're essentially looking to her to do something about this. So, what is Abigail's reaction? Okay, to appease the anger of David. How does she go about doing that? Food. Okay, because he had asked for that in the first place. So she's going to do her best to put together a feast, kind of picnic style here, and take care of that. And then she's still going to have to deal with David's hurt pride, the insult that her husband has issued to Nabal. So she's got two things to do here. The food is probably the easy part. So she puts together what does she gather up here? A little bit, a lot, hard to say based on. Julie says it's a lot. Okay. So remember, he's got 600 men, and she gets five sheep, which doesn't seem like a lot for 600 men. But I think it's more. But there's other things. There's 4 goat skins of wine, and there's the raisins and the dates and bread, and there's a lot of stuff she puts together here. She has to put it on donkeys, so it's significant enough. She has to transport with some animals, but it seems like she's just whatever she can do quickly is what she's putting together. The 5 sheep are what was already laying there prepared. She just loads them up. So she's in a hurry here to get something to David, and she sends it ahead with her servants, and then she gets ready and she goes out and she encounters David. David is on his way, and she meets him on the way. So what is her approach? How does she handle David? She reasons with him. Is he in a reasonable state of mind right now? He's not. So how does she get past that? He's in a rage. How does she even get him to listen at all? Okay. She takes the blame. Zach? Okay. Yeah, so she is having to undo a lot of hurt pride on David here. And so, I mean, I call it a crucial conversation and done well. Others may say, well, she's just laying it on thick, just trying to get David to calm down. Glenn?
It's hard to maintain that level of anger when someone comes to you humbly and saying, all right, look, you were wrong, but here's a gift, and then let's have a conversation.
Okay.
And especially with David, he seems to respond very differently to that approach.
Okay, humility being. Okay, good. Other comments on Abigail's approach? The beauty helps, you think?
Because here he is, he's full all this immigrant years. Down at my feet, she's begging my forgiveness. It's going to kind of go along track.
Okay. Mark?
Those details about physical appearance don't appear very often in the Old Testament or the New Testament for that matter. So this is important. By the way, they end up getting pitched later.
Right. Spoiler alert. Yeah. He does. He does. And is David unlike Samson in some of these aspects? I mean,
That's exactly right.
yeah.
That's exactly right.
He is highly influenced by women of beauty, and it leads him down a lot of roads he shouldn't have gone down. In this case, Abigail, she had that going for her. If Abigail had not been beautiful, would the results have been different, do you think?
Well, she finds common ground immediately
Okay.
by throwing Nabal under the bus.
Oh, she throws me. Okay.
And that's something
Was that?
they can both agree upon just right off.
Okay, so finding common ground, we're going to see, is really important when you're having these kind of conversations. And she does that in a few different ways. And throwing Nabal under the bus is one. Is that unjustified? Okay. She apologizes also, someone had noted. What did she have to apologize for? She hadn't done anything? She wasn't even there. So why did she apologize? She loved her family. Sure. Okay. Okay. She wasn't insincere in her conversation with David. She sided with David as part of her approach. She found common ground as part of her approach. She apologized, I think, to draw his attention to her. Is it appropriate for us sometimes to apologize when it may not be our fault? It's appropriate? Is it dishonest? Okay. Okay. Okay.
And then you find out what the real problem.
Yeah. So David obviously thinks he's been wronged. She needs to have a conversation with him, and it's going to be for his benefit as well as for hers to have this conversation. I think she is apologizing, as you said, to break down the wall, and they can start to have a conversation. Because at this point, when David first approaches, he's not in any frame of mind for a conversation. His frame of mind is violence, and that's what he's after. Laverne?
Well, there are two things. The servants went to her,
Mm-hmm.
and that gives you an indication that she had got the servants to escape his stupidity before,
Okay.
and that she would take care of it.
Okay.
And then, even nowadays, if your husband or your child or whatever insults somebody, many times you apologize for the family.
Okay. Apologies for the family, yeah. On behalf of the family, essentially. Okay. Is the language of servants used about their master, is that kind of startling? I mean, would you normally expect in this time frame, or maybe in future times, for a servant to say to the master's wife, "We all know our master. You know, you can't talk to him. He's a worthless fellow." The fact that the servants are having this conversation with her tells me that he really was as bad as billed here. This is really the kind of person that everyone knew, and they talked about it even with the boss's wife, about how difficult he was to.
Very trusting relationship with the servants.
It could be a trusting relationship. It could just be, and that's, you would think it would have to be, because once the master hears that kind of language, he wouldn't stand for that. And it could just be that past experiences were such that they knew they had to go to her for any kind of justice in this situation. Glenn?
There's also David and 600 fighting men who have been in your neighborhood for a while, but they will have a reputation. And if you watch your master insult them and send them away, you know what's coming.
Okay, and that brings up another point. Nabal says, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" I don't know who these people are. Did Nabal really and truly not know who David was? How do I hear like people say that he knew? How do we know he knew? It was part of the insult, but also his comment about there's a lot of people running away from their masters. That's a reference to David and Saul. That's a clue. But also, did Abigail know who David was? Clearly, based on her conversation with David, she knew a lot about David. She knew he was God's anointed. She knew he was going to be the king of it. She knew all these things. So she knew that surely Nabal. This is all part of the insult. So the fact that Abigail knew so much about David helps her in this conversation that she has with him. So one thing I noticed, and you've already mentioned a lot of the techniques she used, she thanks David for his restraint in this situation well before he's ever shown any restraint. I think that's a technique here to reference him back to his own value system. You know, you're not the kind of person that's going to shed innocent blood. You're not the kind of person that's going to take revenge for themselves. So I appreciate your restraint. Well, he hadn't shown restraint yet, but she's reinforcing his own belief system to prevent him from doing something that he was going to regret. And that's a big part of this.
She name drops it. She brought God into it.
She brought God into it?
Yeah, because she told him, you know what you're doing. You're working for God.
Right. Yeah, and so and that's very effective also when we're dealing with people and we're at a conflict point with somebody else. If we have common values, and Abigail clearly was God-fearing, wanted what God wanted, and David had that in common. To bring them together on that is an effective way to get past this conflict. So that was there as well. So what's the reaction? How does David respond to this conversation with Abigail? What's that? He thanked her. He did. Who else did he thank? He thanked God. That's right. Yeah, so David is calmed by her discourse, her conversation with him, to the point where he realizes he was about to do something that was sinful. And so he thanks God for sending Abigail. And he thanked Abigail, which I think, you know, David, he loses control at times. He comes back to God when he's done that. And I think here he's realizing Abigail was really God's messenger here. Was Abigail given any kind of direct revelation from God to do this? Does it make her any less a messenger for God in this situation? She was looking out for God's interest in for David to continue to be one of God's servants. So is it possible that in our lives we can sometimes be that same force for somebody else, really sent by God based on our behavior? Yep. Well, she knew that David had been promised the kingdom. Apparently, that was widely known at this point, and she believed it. And so she also, when she said that, she says, when you come into your kingdom, remember me. Now, I don't know what she meant by that, but she's, again, just acknowledging David as God's anointed there. Okay, any details from the story? Yes, Nikki? Uh-huh. Right. Right.
So she just thinks that, you know, we, as a parent, as we try to attract our children, when we see them doing something rash or everything wrong, we kind of gently have to tell them, you know, look back on this.
With regrets?
And wish you had not done this.
Right.
So it's just kind of, you know, sometimes that shakes a person.
It was effective with David. And the way she laid that out, you're right. You're going to come into the kingdom. You're going to look back on this with regret if you proceed. And she saved him from doing that. Not everyone who we use that on is going to be mature enough to acknowledge that. But it certainly is something that's a tool for us. Pardon? Okay. Yeah. This was kind of a Nathan the prophet moment for confronting David when he was, at that point, had already sinned, and here he's about to sin. Okay. Other comments on the facts of the story before we get into the lesson sheet and a little bit of speculation? Did I miss any important facts? Okay. So on the lesson sheet, let's do that. The very first box asks, what is the relationship with the influenced individual? No relationship. They are strangers. I wanted to point this out because she was highly influential to David, even though she was just a stranger. Okay, and pointing out for us that just because we don't know somebody or just have met somebody doesn't make us not influential. If we're wise and discerning, like Abigail was here, we can be influential. We're going to see next week another example of a woman who didn't know David, who was highly influential there too. And so there's multiple ways we can be influential. We saw with Ruth and Boaz, she was very influential even though they had not met because of her deeds and what she had done, her reputation. In this case, David doesn't have that either. He just is confronted by her, and she is able to take the situation and find a way to be influential in a really critical moment. Glenn, do you have a comment?
I don't know if I would call it relationship necessarily, but it kind of goes that way. Is worse than we haven't met before. She's from the camp of a declared enemy.
Okay. So maybe worse than stranger because she's admitting to being Nabal's wife. Nabal has been declared the enemy. Okay. So that just makes it more surprising that she was influential. Yes?
And also, when you think about Abigail, our county review, she was extremely smart because everything that she possibly could do to turn this around, she did. Very smart and very, very brave. Because not knowing her, yeah, in fact, she did that. She was extremely brave.
She was really brave. And I can play devil's advocate with that, though, and say, well, what choice did she have? Did she have a choice in this situation, aside from confronting David? She could have sat home, and what would that have gotten her? Okay, well, her children would have been killed, her servants, her husband. So another option could have been she could have just packed up her kids and left Nabal and the servants to fend for themselves. So there was, Jennifer, do you have a comment? Okay, so there were maybe a few options here, and certainly I think the most brave response was to confront, which is what, because some people are so frightened they're just frozen into inaction. Okay.
She was very brave. She took the situation herself. She was a servant.
Okay. Yeah, she didn't send a servant. She was going to take action herself, and she was decisive. Why would she even practice?
Have to think about maybe she just said, well, I got to do that because I've done it 3 times
Okay.
this week already. And it was just routine for her.
So Gail points out this is probably routine based on Nabal's character. She was probably skilled at defusing situations, and that's likely. Okay. So the next box was a relationship between the two, long-term, short-term. Well, we've already said they didn't know each other, so that's an A on that box. Overall result for David, positive or negative? Positive, obviously. What about for Abigail? Positive. It's a win-win. So that was good. What was the method of her influence? What's that? Persuasion. Okay, right. She did persuade him. She reasoned with him. Humility, okay. Practical. Gifts, okay. She led with the gifts, okay. Okay, I mean, and we noted some of those smaller tools like apology, finding common ground, referring him back to his own value system, all these things. She was using every thing she could think of to persuade him, and she was effective. The impact of the influence. What was the impact? Saved lives. Okay. What about for David? Okay, he would have regretted, right? Think about a man in David's situation. Eventually, you're going to be king. If he had slaughtered a family, how would that have set him up in the future in his kingdom? I mean, I'm thinking about, yeah, that's everyone's going to know, and also you might make some enemies that will be just a stumbling block in the future if you start out as the king who's already murdered a family, a prominent family in your kingdom. I mean, so we don't know what would have happened, but the potentially creating political enemies is something that he avoided by not killing them. Would God have had looked favorably on David's reaction if he had gone through with what he was going to do? Can we agree that he was about to sin? Do y'all agree that that was what he was about to do? Yeah, it would have been sinful to shed all this innocent blood. Okay, David admitted as much. So what was prevented here, or the impact was, he didn't sin and he didn't get further judgment from God. Because although God loved David because David loved God, David would punish, or God would punish David for these things. So here, he avoided God's judgment and punishment as well. Gus?
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt David's situation to have somebody with Abigail's talents.
In his household? Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't hurt to have someone like Abigail in your house. That's what's going to happen. Okay. And that's true. And yet, even so, David still does bonehead things with women, even with Abigail there in his household. But you're right. To have somebody like that close as a counselor is incredibly valuable. Okay, next box. Was the influence a result of a conscious effort? Yes, it was. Was this part of a larger pattern in their lives? Well, no, they hadn't met before. There was no pattern yet, so we can put a note there. Was David aware of the effort to influence him? He was aware. Did he see? Do you think he understood all the techniques she was using? Yeah, probably not. I mean, he's mad. He's just reacting to what's occurred. And he's not noticing perhaps all the little things she's doing to try to get him to a point where he's reasonable. It doesn't matter. She's using those to draw him back into a discussion between two mature, God-fearing adults. Raul? Okay. Right. Okay. Well, that's the loving person who doesn't just hear about a problem, but becomes a peacemaker, right? And that's what God loves. So within a congregation, to have people who are going to take action to make peace, as opposed to those who are just interested in hearing about all the conflicts and not really.
Another good point is the risk. You can decide somebody's not a force. not be a pussy. So it's squeezing up a little bit. I just want to, but we can pussy up a little, positive things or us defended, and we can be a pussy, and we can listen to reason and do whatever necessary.
What was Abigail risking by going to see David? Worst case scenario, what happens to her when she gets to David? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he could have killed her in a rage. I mean, he hadn't vowed to kill anybody but the males. So perhaps by just staying at home, she was going to lose her family, but her own life would have been spared. By going to David, she was risking getting caught up in this. So, and she took action anyway. Okay, now let's keep moving through the chart. Would David have been better off or worse off without the influence? Clearly worse, yes. Some speculation here. What would have been the result of the situation without the influence? If Abigail hadn't confronted him along the way, what do you suppose would have happened? Lots of bloodshed. Okay, so Rollo was thinking that David's going to go through with his vow, which I think it's reasonable to expect that. Okay, which we said that would have been sinful, and it would have created judgment by God and likely some punishment, possibly some problems when David did take the throne. Yes, sir.
You know, God was with David, but literally God necessarily would have taken David's side in such a matter. So I don't think there's, even though David was a mighty warrior, I don't think there's any guarantee that he would emerge from that conflict unscathed himself.
Okay, that's possible. Yeah, that God maybe not have. You know, when David went to battle, God was always with him and protected David and through some incredible odds. And that didn't have to be the case if David was acting without God's approval. True. Okay. All right. So what kind of takeaways do we get from the lesson and from Abigail's influence today? What are some takeaways? Anybody have anything they want to share?
Only one of those things that interested me about Abigail was actually she was very decisive. She didn't sit around and wait to see if it was coming. So Brett, she took action and whatever she had.
Okay. So Abigail was decisive and she took action. So the takeaway is we should be the same. Okay. All right. Good.
There should always be,
There should always be an adult in the conversation. Hopefully it's us. Right? Okay. Laverne?
From David's point of view, the takeaway is be careful what you say and
Okay. From David's perspective. Yeah. When we're angry, we can sin. And that's an opportunity the devil is looking for. Rob? Okay. Yeah. Hasty to take vengeance. And that's part of that's tied to pride, right? Our pride getting injured. Have a beautiful wife. It's not a bad thing. And David took that to the extreme. He wanted lots of beautiful wives, and it created problems instead. But yeah, so how did Nabal end up with Abigail anyway? Yeah, yeah. So Julie points out she probably didn't have a choice back then. That's likely. So she was playing with the hand she was dealt. Okay. All right. So as we've already alluded to, the way this plays out is the next day after David has gone back and things have been smoothed over, Abigail tells Nabal what has happened. And it says he became like a stone. He was so overcome in fear that he was unresponsive for a time. And then 10 days after that, he dies. Doesn't give us a lot of information about what all happened there. Was that God's judgment? Is that just a coincidence or what? But the result was David hears of it, and David sends for Abigail. She's still in mourning, and yet what does she do when she gets David's message? She packs up immediately and she's gone. Yeah, okay. So, Nikki? Okay, so, okay, very good. 38, okay, God, your judgment there. A stroke of some kind of thing, okay, sounds like it. Okay. Okay. So now David has, this is his second or third wife. You would think that with Abigail, he would be in a better position to make wise decisions moving forward. That's not necessarily the case. We don't read about Abigail any further, other than she's the first son, I think, that David had was hers. There are other wives, or at least one, who we're going to find out is extremely influential all the way through his life until his death, on his deathbed. Nathan the prophet has a problem that he needs to talk to David about. And has Nathan ever had any experience dealing with David in crucial moments? Yeah, we talked about that today. Nathan is not afraid to go to David and tell David he's messed up. But in this other instance, Nathan is going to go find one of David's wives to help him with a problem. And it's not Abigail. So whatever value Abigail brought to David, it's hard to see from the text how that played out. A couple thought questions, and we're really out of time. I'll just mention these. And we already covered some of these. The one about how did Abigail learn these effective techniques? We're probably dealing with Nabal's messes day to day. We talked about the method she used to influence David. And do good people get angry? That's the last. Clearly, why if you're a good person, why would you ever have anything to be angry about? We're human. That's right, yeah. And so we have to deal with anger because it does lead to sin if it's left unchecked. And there's a lot of scripture that give us guidance on that. And David's just a good example. Okay, so next week, Bathsheba will be the lesson. And thanks for your comments.